Hi everyone. Today I'm speaking with Scott Devlin. Scott studied geophysics at the University of Leeds. I met him when we both lived in Sheffield in the UK, and about 7 years ago he moved to Brisbane in Australia. Initially he was a sales manager when he lived there, and then he started working for Creation Ministries International, CMI for short, and it's particularly about his work in this role and topics that are related to CMI that I want to ask you about today, Scott. So last podcast I introduced Town Green on the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. And today I want to talk about the first book in the Bible, the book of Genesis, the book of creation. So thank you for agreeing to speak with me today, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, Scott is a good friend, so it's really good to see you and be able to speak with you. And you're a busy family man, so I appreciate your time. So let's start with why did you start to work for CMI?
Yeah, good question. Well, there's a bit of a story behind it. So, as you said, myself and my wife moved out to Australia 7 years ago. We felt like the Lord sent us out here, and I originally wanted to get a job in ministry, but I felt the Lord say kind of the commercial world, and so I got a job doing something similar to what I'd previously done, and that seemed a good way to go. And then I was really having a good time in my job. I had it was a good situation, and then it changed, and so I thought, well, I need to look for a new job, and this was about 4 years ago, so about 3 years into being in Australia. So I started looking for another job, and I went to an interview, and then outside of the company where I went for the interview, there was a signboard saying Creation Ministries International, and I'd heard of the organization before, and I thought I really want to go to one of their talks and hear one of their scientists speak because I'm interested in that kind of thing. I've got a background in science and I believe the Bible, but I don't know a lot about it. So I went into the office afterwards. So I went for this interview for this other job, and it turned out that this other job was going to be in another area of Queensland that where I didn't live. And I said, look, I don't want the job. And they said, well, we don't want you if you're not going to move. And I said, I don't want to move. So the interview was kind of a waste of time in that way, the interview for the job I was going for. But then I just walked outdoors and I saw Creation Ministries International. So I walked over and I knocked on their door, went in and said, look, I've got a background in geophysics. Do you employ a geologist? I'd love to sit down and have a chat, just to kind of work out, how does this whole thing work? How do we talk about the Bible and evolution? How do we talk about long ages and short ages? And so, I'm just quite interested in what they do. So I went and had a chat. And as I was sitting down with my now colleague, Taz Walker, Dr. Taz Walker, I was talking with him and I was just looking around the room and said, oh, what's it like to work here? Because I thought, it looks like you get time to do a bit of research and a bit of study. And I like studying and researching different topics. And so he started talking, but he'd already felt like the Lord had said to him as soon as I went in, this person will be a good speaker for CMI and another speaker. So one thing led to another, and I ended up working there basically. So yeah, that's how I ended up there. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good. I guess from a personal point of view, what brings you alive about the work at CMI? Like what are you really passionate about and yeah.
Yeah, good question. So I guess when I walked in that door and I went to go and speak to my colleague Taz, I held the position that I'm a Christian because I've encountered God and I can't deny that He's real. And He's tangibly changed my life. And I've had many times when I I know he's with me and I can talk to him and hear him. And so I know God's real and that I know his word is true because that's also stood the test of time. I think I've been a Christian 19 years now. Um, so I know the Bible to be true and I know God to be true. So I know what it says in this word is true. And having, a little bit of a background in science, I understood that there's certain limitations to what science can tell us. In the public eye, science is often held in high regard because of the great achievements that have been made as a result of what I would call experimental science. And that's a kind of a repeatable, testable science. But even that type of science, maybe we'll get on to talk later about historical science, which is really where, the origins come in and where the theory of evolution or the biblical story, and that debate comes in. But even in the experimental type of science, it was apparent to me that we have theories. So something that really impacted me when I was younger was when I studied Newtonian mechanics or Newtonian physics. And so that's, F equals ma. That's like, mass. When we drop a mass, it drops to the earth because the earth attracts the mass. And, Isaac Newton is said to have had an apple fall on his head, and he had this realization that masses attract, and that's how the planets spin around the solar system. So I remember learning that at kind of GCSE level, and then once I went to A level, we started learning Einstein relativity, and then I figured out, oh, Newtonian mechanics isn't quite right. And what I realized was, because I believed it as fact, so I believed a theory as fact, and I had an experience of finding out that it wasn't actually fact because there was a better theory that fitted the data better. And I remember that really making a big impact on me as a young man, being, oh, and so this was actually before I was a Christian as well. I had this realization that, oh, like even in experimental science, we can do repeatable, testable experiments. And so in terms of the naturalistic laws that we know of that work today in this present world, we know that's a good conclusion. We can reach good conclusions like that. But there's still theories about how the thing actually works because of the discrepancy. So for example, in Newtonian mechanics, what they found out was that Mercury, the planet Mercury that spins closer to the sun, actually has some perturbations in it, which means it doesn't rotate around it doesn't circle around the sun, just like the equations of Newtonian physics would say. Whereas when you use Einstein's relativity, then you get a better match to actually what happens. So when you use the maths and the theory, you get a better match with another theory. But before that, I kind of thought it was so convincing that Newtonian physics is so convincing, and it must have been like that for the 19th century world at the time. It was so convincing that you thought he'd tapped the fundamental truths of the universe and that he'd actually, like, it makes so much sense. And anyone that's kind of learned that, which I guess most of us have in kind of GCSE maths and physics, it makes so much sense. You think that's actually how it works, but it is just a theory. So anyway, I'd had that experience as I was younger, and then I'd become a Christian when I was 18 and seeing God was real and do real things and started to believe in not just the naturalistic world, but also there's a supernatural element. And not that predominantly we live in a naturalistic world, but occasionally these supernatural events happen. And so that really opened my mind up to actually, supernatural events can be true and the Bible's true. Therefore, the story of God creating in Genesis was not problematic for me because I believe in a supernatural God that does supernatural things, and this is a supernatural creation. And I didn't have a lot of that experience with science and theories versus fact. Yeah, really helped me grab hold of that as true. So it's a bit of a long answer. So then when I walked into Creation Ministries, I believed the Bible to be true. And I knew a little bit about evolution, and I knew that just didn't match the character of God because it was survival of the fittest or the advancement of the species through death of the least fit. And I thought that's not the God of the Bible. God would not create a process like that. So I had that belief that, okay, that isn't the way God created things through evolution. And I thought the Bible must be true front to back. Therefore, if you use the genealogical ages that you can get by mapping out the Bible and get an age of the earth or the universe of about 6,000 years, I thought, well, that's probably true. But I wasn't evangelical about that fact about the young earth. But then on joining CMI, I saw the theological implications of accepting an old age. So I wasn't what you would call a theistic evolutionist when I walked in there, and I was probably a young earth creationist, or a biblical creationist, as we call it. But I wasn't evangelical about that fact, because I didn't think it mattered too much to the text. But then when I started looking at it, I realized, oh, there's some big problems here. And if you try and fit the old ages, so you try and fit the billions of years into, as proposed by naturalistic science, as you try and fit that into the biblical narrative, it doesn't really make sense. So since I've become more evangelical about that. And so I think your question was, what why am I passionate about it? And I guess that's so the big issue is the issue of death coming before sin. So, and that means you affect the gospel. So the billions of years doesn't work with the logical flow of the gospel, and therefore you end up with this position where, well, why did Jesus even come? Because if death and suffering had always been there before Adam and Eve, was Jesus really reversing the original curse? Why did he need to die and rise again? And of course, that's fundamental to our salvation. Yeah, so that's probably what's most important about all of this discussion. The rest of it's really interesting, and I like talking about history and science and philosophy. I just find it really interesting and learning a lot more. But the reason why this is an important subject to talk about is, one, because of the authority of the Bible and the perspicuity of the Bible, that it should mean what it says. And so that's one thing I think is really important. And two, I mean, there's a number of things, but these are the top two. Yeah, so there'd be that. And then the second one is the way the gospel works. So the effect that long ages or evolution has on the doctrine of original sin. So it effectively does away with the doctrine of original sin, which is a big problem for the gospel. So how can you be bold in talking about the gospel and that being the solution if death, disease, and suffering have always been here? And we know the last enemy is death. Like, that is an enemy in God's mind. One other thing I'll mention is the goodness of God. Is, okay, if God did create, is God good? And did he originally create an original good world? And is he going to restore that original good world? Are we going to get a new heaven and a new earth? Is that going to be a new heaven and a new earth with the process of evolution and death, disease, and suffering? Or is that going to be like the original creation? And I guess another one is healing. If God is going to heal today, why would he heal things that he originally meant to be there? So and probably go on with that list, but they're probably some of the important things why I think this is an important thing to talk about. Now, it's not, some people ask, guys, this, sounds like you think it's critical for your salvation. It's like, well, like, no, you do. It's not, you believe in the gospel for salvation, but I think there's a lot of barriers to the gospel that have been put up by evolution and long ages.
Yeah,
and those barriers should be torn down.
Yeah, I can really see that in you, like your passion for Jesus and the gospel, and how some of these, like, if you don't have a biblical worldview, which even many Christians don't have a biblical worldview because of what we're taught in school.
Yes.
I was taught this in school in Norway 20 years ago or more. My parents, even before that, were taught a lot of these things. That goes against what the Bible says. But what would you agree or disagree with this statement, and why? The Bible is not a science book.
Interesting question. Yeah. So I would say the Bible is a history book. And that is important because people think about this debate, right? The evolution creation debate. And we often think of it science versus science. Oh, no, sorry, science versus faith, right? Science versus faith. And then you think, well, so the argument goes, the Bible is not a science book. and that's maybe where you've heard that question. The Bible is not a science book, therefore it shouldn't talk about the realm of science. Science should talk about science, and the Bible should just talk about faith. But really, I would say it's not a science versus faith. It's a history versus history. And then the question is, which history are you going to trust? Because generally with history, what we do, if you want to find out what happened in World War II, maybe there's someone that was alive in World War II. They're probably, in their 90s, or at the moment, late 90s. They're in World War II. You can go and ask them. They were actually there. Or if you want to find something that happened in World War I, well, you're going to have to pick a book up, or you're going to have to look up Wikipedia, Britannica. You're going to have to look up a website or read a book. Now, the reason you can be sure what happened in the past is because people were there to write it down. And so that's written history. And written history goes back so far. And then we have more like archaeological history. So, you have cave paintings, cave drawings, you have Egyptian artifacts, and that records history. So people were there and they recorded it. Now, what do you do when you go further back in time? Well, if you want to go further back in time than written history, than human history or recorded history. So if you want to go back further than recorded history, you have to, what's happened in most secular universities across the world is this principle of uniformitarianism that came about 200 years ago, and that's been the foundation for science to attempt to go further back than written recorded history. So you're not relying on someone writing down an event. What you're relying on is that the current day processes that are working in the world have been going on as they are now in the distant past, and they've always been going on that same way. And if you make that assumption, then you have a history, and that's a scientific history. But I would say, I don't think that's a very different type of science. That's what I would call a historical science. And really, that's science overstepping its bounds. So I think the Bible doesn't overstep its bounds in history because it's got a lot of history in it. Now, of course, you've got the Psalms, the poems, you've got prophetic passages in there, but all of it records real life in real time. And it's a history book with some poems in it, it's a history book with some prophetic things in, but it's actually got real recorded dates as well. And a lot of these have been checked out. So, sorry, long answer again. So the question was is the Bible, is it a science book? And I said, no, it's a history book. And what I was trying to say is, in the questions of origins, you don't want to rely on science. You want to rely on history. If you're going to tell about something in the distant past, unless someone recorded it, that's not the scientific method. The scientific method is you come up with a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis, and you get a result to see that your hypothesis was either wrong or correct. And then you might refine your hypothesis and try again and see if you get it exactly right. And if you get it exactly right, you can do it again and again and again and again. And you can do it, and you can give it to someone else to do, and they'll get the same result. You can give it to someone else to do in 20 years' time or 100 years' time, they'll get the same result. For example, water boils at 100 centigrade at sea level, no matter where you are on the earth. You can do that experiment, you'll always find water boils at 100 centigrade, no matter whether you did it today or 100 years ago. So it doesn't change with time, and it follows the experimental method. But if you're going to come up with a conclusion about what happened in the past, there isn't a scientific method, there isn't a hypothesis that you can test, because you have to include assumptions about the past. You have to say, and one of the main assumptions I've already mentioned, and that is the assumption of uniformitarianism, which just means everything's going on the same as it has been. It's actually a prophecy in the Bible that in the last days people will, it's in 2 Peter, that people will assume the principle of uniformitarianism.
Yeah.
And that's why they'll get things wrong.
That's interesting. Why do you think why do you think what we believe about the creation of the world, or if, like, for people who don't believe in that it was created, how the world started, why do you think that is important, what we think and believe about those things?
Yeah. Yeah, so why is it important about how we think the world came about? So we're saying that it's created. Yeah, as a Christian, I believe the world was created, and if you if you're of another faith, you probably have another creation story. But if you are atheist, then the only option you've got is purely naturalistic means, which I only believed in naturalistic things before I had an encounter with Jesus. I only believed naturalistic things existed. Therefore, the naturalistic method should probably extend back to infinity, essentially. And so, yeah, and so the reason why these things are important are obviously because, well, where did you come from? So if you are a random accident, then what you do doesn't really matter. But if you're here, if you're created by a God and made in his image, then you have some responsibility. You're going to meet him when you die. Like there's some responsibility, there's and there's some purpose as well. So yeah, they're two. Whereas if you just come from naturalistic random processes, then there isn't a lot of ultimate consequences to what you do. Obviously, there's consequences in day-to-day life, and you learn them as you grow up, but really, I guess in my mind, like if I believe that was true, I may as well seek the best thing for myself, or seek the best that I can get in this life. Whereas when you realize you're created, then you have someone you're answerable to, and that means you're also living for another age, not living for this age right now, which is incredibly freeing.
Mm. Mm. So let's look at how Genesis starts. God created the heavens and the earth, and it says that he created the earth in over 7 days, or over 6 days, and then on the seventh day was a rest day.
Yeah.
Do you believe like that is the time it took for God to create the world, like the 7 days in our, a Monday to Sunday, for example, for us?
Yeah, good question. And so the word used there in the Hebrew is yom, for day, and that's used a lot in the Bible. And so often it's been said, well, yom can mean an extended period of time, because we see other examples of that in the Bible. And so that's true. The word day, I mean, even in English, we observe this, right? We say, so here's a sentence we could say, in my father's day, it took 8 days to travel from Edinburgh to London. That is if you traveled in the day and in the night. So I've used the word day 3 times in that sentence. I said, in my father's day. When does that mean? That means like maybe 40 years ago. It took 8 days. Did I say? Yeah, 7 or 8 days. So how long is that? Well, that's a 24-hour day, 8 days, to travel there day and night. Now, when I said day and the day and night, what did I mean? I meant 12 hours, or however long it was daytime, when it's winter or summer. So there's 3 different time periods in one sentence there. So the key is the context. The context tells you what it means. And Genesis is really, really very clear. It says there was evening and there was morning the first day. There was evening, there was morning the second day. There was evening, there was morning the third day. And so that's repeated throughout as it describes the different things that were made on each day. So not only do you have a number for the day, you have this description of evening and morning, evening and morning. So the context tells you that these are normal 24-hour days. So 6 24-hour days to make the world, and then the 7th was when God rested. And of course that's significant, because there's no celestial object that tells us how long a week is. Like, we can look at the moon, and that tells us when a month is, because the moon rotates around the Earth, or roughly. I mean, we use solar months now, but the original month was from the moon. And then we know how long a day is because the Earth spins around once. And we know how long a year is because the Earth goes around the sun. But how do we know how long a week is? There's no celestial object that has an exact 7-day period. And really, the week came from the Jews, and the Jews got it from God. Well, the Hebrews, sorry, yeah, got it from God. And so God made the world in 7 days. And so that's actually what it says in Exodus 20:11. So, most of the Bible is written by man, but there is, of course, by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And I believe it's totally what God wanted to put on the page. But there is a portion of the Bible that was written directly by God. Do you know which bit that is?
No, I don't know. What is it?
It's a little bit of a trick question, but the tablets, right? The Ten Commandments, they were written directly by God. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So anyway, on one of the commandments is God says you shall work 6 days and rest one day. Why? He says because he made the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So God's like kind of telling it. So maybe you didn't want to get it from Genesis. You can get it there from Exodus. It says, okay, look, I made the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So I want you to do likewise. And it's so interesting that our working week is still 7 days after 6,000 years. Well, I mean, I guess the working week wasn't really, or the 7-day week was not really instituted until about 1,500 years after creation, because it was when Moses was about. But people have toyed with other working weeks. People have tried 10 days, 5 days. I think it was the Russians, like 80 years ago, 100 years ago, something like that. They were communists, so they were anti-God, and they wanted to try a different thing to a working week. But we've always found that it doesn't work quite well, that we're actually designed for a 7-day week. I find that fascinating, that those experiments have been done. We're actually designed for a 7-day week, and that's how what God set it up by. And the reason he gave us that instruction was because that's what he did. Because the point is, right, this is a great question that I sometimes get from kids is, or I sometimes ask kids, like, why did God not create the world like that? I sometimes ask that. I get answers like, well, he needed some time to think about it, or what the other answers I get are, he wanted to take his time, or it was too difficult to do all at once. And I say, well, God's God, he could do it just like that. It's like, oh yeah, he could do it just like that. And say, oh, okay, and then leading on to, well, he did it as an example for us that we would see what our working week was.
That's cool. So you were saying that the Bible is a historical book, and like for history to be written down, it needs to be observed. And considering there were no human beings at the very start of Genesis,
yes,
who was the author of the creation story, do you think? And how did they find out that was how the world was created?
Yeah, good question. Good question. So it's so essentially God is the author. He was there and he can testify to it. And so we've got the book of Genesis, which we know is Genesis and Exodus. We've got the Pentateuch written by Moses. And so I'd often heard that Pentateuch or Moses was given as a revelation from God, the creation story. But and that might be true, but it could have also, I've only more recently realized this, was that it could have also come direct from, well, obviously there was no one there days 1 to 5, right? There was no one there. It was day 6 Adam was created. So there's no one there days 1 to 5. So God would have had to tell someone what happened at some point. Now, whether he told Moses or whether he told Adam or someone in between, I guess that's up for debate. But he could have told Adam. Now, we know that God walked with Adam. He walked before sin, which would have been a few weeks after the first 7 days. There would have been a time of him walking with God, and God would likely have told him about the creation of the world, because Adam was given the job of tending the world, and he was the gardener. He was given the dominion mandate, and therefore God would probably tell him how he made things and why he made things, and as he walked in the garden with him. And so he probably would have got the creation story. And of course, then you've got yeah, and it could have passed down the generations then. And also, if you look at the ages of people, then you're looking at about 900 years, right? So the Adam would have been like his great 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 grandsons, and I think you've only got a few generations from Adam to Noah, and then Noah to Moses is just like one or two generations of people that would still be alive, if that makes sense. So Noah, I think it was Shem that lived a long time, one of Noah's sons, and he could have talked to, is it Adam's grandson? I'd have to look at it again. But basically, there wouldn't have had to be a lot of people passing it on because of these big ages. And then Moses would have heard the story and known the story and written it down. And of course, Noah would have had it. The key thing is Noah taking that story with his family. That would have been key.
I remember when I was so my story with God. I'll just give you a snippet of it. So in high school in Norway, when I was about 16, 17, 18 years old, I was going from being a traditional kind of Christian, just I've grown up in a Christian family, but I didn't have a personal relationship with God as such. I didn't pray to God every day, and I didn't necessarily read the Bible that often. But then I started reading the Bible more, and I read Genesis quite a lot because I would often start at the start and then start again.
Yes.
And one of the things that I found quite strange was, like you just mentioned, that people lived for a long time. In our day and age, people are living, very few people live past 100 years. Most people die sometime between 70 and 100 years. And I guess that's, yeah, but anyway, so in Genesis, people are living like 800, 900 years before they die. So why do you think that was the case? Why did they live for so long compared with what it's like now?
Yeah, it seems very abstract to us now, and how that would have worked. So what's quite interesting about this is that we are accumulating mutations in our genome. So inside every single cell, I think we have about 30 billion, is it so 3 trillion cells, something like 3 trillion cells, and in each cell we have a nucleus, and inside the cell we have the DNA, which you would have heard about. And so the DNA has 3 billion nucleotide pairs, so it's 3 billion letters. Now that is a fragile thing, and we have a lot of repair mechanisms which are absolutely incredible, show incredible design in the body that keep the DNA in the right places even when we receive damage. But having said that, we live in this fallen world, and there are issues, radiation, different things that can cause mutations. And most of those mutations get mixed up most of those mutations are alleviated in the next generation, because we get half our DNA from our mum and half from our dad, and so it meets the base pairs each to each, and then if one is a broken copy, we'll take the good copy. But there's some mutations that get passed down generation to generation, and on average the studies show that it's about 100 mutations per generation get passed down. So if you think about that, that's a bit of a problem. And there's this term coined genetic entropy. A guy called Dr. John Sanford used this term, genetic entropy. So it's a bit like entropy of energy, but it's with our genome. So our genome is decaying over time. So if you go back in the past, then you would think you would have less mutations in your genome. And this is quite interesting. So although medical science is helping us live longer, there's actually more genetic diseases. You can see that propagating. And actually, this will be the end of the human race if this keeps going on, which there's no reason it will not keep going on. So unless, I mean, we probably believe Jesus will return sooner, but otherwise this would be an end. We're accumulating 100 mutations per generation. So if you go back in the past, people would have had a much healthier genome. So I believe that would have been one of the reasons. I think there'll be some other reasons as well. Possibly the pre-flood world would have had, well, we know the pre-flood world had much greater biodiversity. So there's much more different vegetation in the pre-flood world because we can see that in the rock record. We can see the fossilized plants and animals. We know that biodiversity was greater. So there's a number of reasons, but I think this is a key one. The genetic. So we would have been genetically a lot healthier in the past. Adam and Eve would have been genetically a lot healthier. And so the really interesting thing about this theory is that that same guy, Dr. John Sanford, who's a geneticist, now retired, he looked at he mapped out what a typical biological decay curve is. And you can see this in populations of animals when you have a bottleneck. So instead of them reproducing, all mixing together to reproduce, and you have a bottleneck, so only a few can reproduce, therefore it's genetically less healthy. And he modeled that for the biblical story as Noah came off the ark. So as Noah came off the ark, the gene pool is much smaller. So that's what you call a bottleneck, a gene pool bottleneck. So you've got this big diversity before, right? You've got Adam and Eve that had, really good genomes, very healthy genomes. And then you've got their sons and daughters, also very healthy genomes. And then as you go on to the flood, 1,500 years later, roughly, then you've got a bottleneck because the only people to survive are Noah, his 3 sons, and his 3 daughters-in-law. So you've got 8 people. So that genetic bottleneck. So if you look at the ages, so when you read the ages, they go 9. I think Noah lived, I think he was about 600 years old when the flood started, but he went on to live to about 900 years old. And then as you go to his sons, and then his grandsons and his great-grandsons, and it goes exponentially down. It goes to like 600. They live to 400, they live to 200, they live to 120. You just see it go down and down. And that, if you map that out as a curve, it matches these biological decay curves. So he modeled it thinking, okay, well, we've seen this happen in animals as their populations go into these bottlenecks. Here we had a human population bottleneck, and the ages map the decay curves that we see. So that I find that quite interesting. So that's why I think that answer is potentially good. One good answer is healthier genomes. Of course, there's a range of answers, but healthier genomes would be like it's interesting how that matches. And we are talking about historical science in a way now. We have got some fundamental written recorded history, and that's the ages. But the Bible doesn't talk about why people lived longer. So we're going extra biblical, and we're using some of the evidence that we have to give you that answer. But I think that's always good to mention, because whenever we come up with theories or ideas about what happened in the past, it's good to be aware of our assumptions and how strongly we can rely on that. But I like that one a lot, because it also tells you that, well, the human population is going to die out one day.
Yeah. Well, so if you believe in that Jesus will return, it's indicating in the Bible that we will how long we live will be reversed, that we will start living longer again after Jesus has returned.
Yeah,
because it says like someone will die at 100 and they will be thought of as someone who died very young.
Yeah.
Something like that. So yeah, if you have some thoughts on like, why do you think, what do you think can cause that reversal in that kind of downward spiral?
Yeah, I've not thought of that before. That's a good question. So Yeah, because you're referring to that passage in Isaiah when it says, in that day, they'll say that, you know, if someone dies at 100, they'll say they're just a kid, they're just a
Yeah,
baby dying at 100.
yeah,
And of course, I think we're on the same page in understanding that that is in the millennium when Jesus will be reigning on the earth. And
yeah,
so, yeah, when I think about that time period, I'm thinking about a future time where Jesus is physically reigning on the earth. He's the supreme ruler over all the earth, and therefore you have no corrupt governments or corrupt systems or corrupt people. Well, I mean, corrupt people in charge anyway, because you have Jesus, you have the perfect leader. And so all of our systems are going to be a lot better. So I guess we'll have better health systems. We might have the best CRISPR 10.0 technology. You know what? Have you heard of this CRISPR thing? Have you heard of
no,
that?
no,
No, so it's just like a way of gene editing, basically, and we're exploring it now, how to edit our genes to, you know, make us healthier and better. Um, so we might have that kind of technology available to us, and I'm just thinking off the cuff here, and then I reckon we'll have really good agriculture. We
mm,
won't have any kind of killer seeds that, you know, the seed dies out after one generation. Like we'll have, you know, we will probably terraform the desert of Australia into massively, really fertile producing lands. We'll have the best plant technology, and you know, we'll just have all of these things. So yeah, I guess in that story there's a few things, but one I think included maybe that says that our the future scientists that live in the millennium, the future geneticists will have genome editing technologies which restore us back to closer to the original design.
mm,
So there's still death in that time for people that are in their natural bodies.
mm,
Um, yeah, it's been a while since I think about this, but last time I thought about it, my understanding was that those that are alive when Jesus, yeah, that's it. So those that are alive when Jesus comes back, right? Because you've been thinking about this more recently than me, I think.
yeah,
When Jesus comes back, we'll see him and we'll become like him.
mm,
We'll see him and we'll become like him instantly. And so there's that instant, and of course he's in his resurrected body at the moment. So
mm,
for us that remain, so for the believers that are in the millennium, that are ruling and reigning in the millennium, they will have a glorified body. They'll have a resurrection body. And so, and the second death will not have any effect on them. So they'll live forever. So it's the people that don't take the mark, that are not yet believers, or the generations that are born in the millennium that will possibly die in the millennium. Is
yeah,
that right?
yeah. So that's what my Bickle is thinking, that there will be a group who are not believers, who have not also not taken the mark of the beast when Jesus returns, and so they're not saved, but they are still going to be alive, and they will probably get saved because Jesus will rule and reign, or a lot of them will. So it's, yeah, he's thinking he's probably talking about them. If they die at 100, they would die early,
Yeah.
and it, and I'm not quite sure where he is thinking logically about this, but he's suggesting that we'll start living longer and longer again, so that those who are alive at the point of Jesus' return might die at 120 or 150, but then the next generation will be
Yeah.
300, or you know.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
Um,
that would make sense with what we were just talking about because all this technology would not be developed initially. I mean, like it's being developed now, right?
mm,
But not nowhere near the pace that it possibly could be. Like if you think of all the systems of the world being really good because you've got the perfect leader, like you just have so many things that are inefficient. I mean, I remember entering university and figuring out that we learn through lectures and thinking this is archaic. Like, how do we? Surely um, surely elites of the earth don't learn through this method.
mm,
Um, and I mean, there's so many inefficiencies everywhere. So imagine a lot of them being taken out, and um, we would come up with some incredible solutions.
mm.
But yeah, interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think I feel like it's really encouraging to talk about like a positive future, and like because there is so much doom and gloom
Yeah,
with things like I'm not going to go into that, but but I'm really encouraged when I've been listening to people who have a positive outlook of the future. And it's kind of given me an inspiration that maybe this is a good topic to talk about, or explore more, why things will get better after Jesus returns.
Yeah, I like it. It's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
And it's very motivating as well.
Yeah, because like it matters what you do now. Like every bit of technology that we improve up until Jesus' return will be, taken even further afterwards. So it's like everything good that you do matters not just in eternity, but for the people who will be alive later.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. And I wonder if, because that will matter in the millennium, but then in the age to come in the new earth, I guess those things won't matter. Like as in, obviously, what we do for the kingdom and out of love through faith are going to have eternal consequences. But in terms of technological breakthrough that we're talking about, will that matter in the age to come?
Yeah, I find it fascinating how it's in the Bible. There is a lot on, if you take a biblical age of the earth view like you have, maybe we can talk some more about that. There's a lot of information packed into these 7,000 something years. Maybe it's 8,000 in the end. But there is not very much information about what comes after that. I find that quite fascinating, and like Jesus says a statement about that there is nothing in the Old Testament. I don't quite remember exactly what it's like, but he's talking about the Word of God. Nothing will be removed or changed until everything is fulfilled.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about.
So it seems like the validity of the Bible, like it's like maybe there's going to be a Bible upgrade or something after the millennium, because it seems like it's probably, it is an eternal book, but it seems like there is something more to come after the Bible, because at the end of Revelation it talks about the new heavens and the new earth. You're on mute at the moment. You're on mute at the moment, Scott.
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, I was just saying that I'm not sure that passage. I was just looking at it's Matthew 5:18, but it says, "For I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle shall in no ways pass from the law till all is fulfilled." That's King James Version. So I don't know what it means by till all is fulfilled. I guess, yeah, you're saying, okay, in the age to come, it's fulfilled.
Yeah, it seems like we're waiting for everything to be fulfilled, either like up until Jesus' return, and also in the millennium. There is quite a lot, especially in the Old Testament, about what the millennium will be like. We mentioned like that people will live longer, for example, and everyone will prosper because of Jesus' reign. But there was so there is before we finish today, I want to touch on the Darwinian evolutionary theory, the ape to human evolution that I was taught in school, and that was a stumbling block for me when I started reading the Bible. like and really wanted to believe it, but it was like didn't really match with what I had been taught in school. And there's this YouTube video that you've done online. I'll just quickly share some screenshots from there. Can you see my screen?
Oh yeah.
So where is the evidence from ape to human evolution, and did the missing link Homo habilis ever exist? And in this video you're claiming that no, that missing link between stooped ape and upright man, basic instinct and intelligent thoughts, and animal noise and intelligent speech never existed, that it was actually just a combination of ape bones and human bones that they claimed was the missing link. So it was really inspiring to watch that video. For those who want to watch it, I typed in CMI ape to man to find it. So is there actually not evidence that the ape to human evolution took place? Have people proven that? Do they claim to have proven that? And because to me, like you've convinced me that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
But for those who like this kind of comes as a shock to, like, what would you say to them?
Yeah. Just say go and watch the video. Because it's only like a 4-minute video, but we've put a lot of references in there, so you can go and check out the references. So how are you going to prove something that happened in the distant past? Well, we know there's fossils in the ground. Now, how those fossils got there is a whole other discussion, and maybe we can touch on that another time or later. But if you assume the fossils got there over a very long period of time, then which is the naturalistic evolution story, then you could say, well, we should be able to find the fossils of our ancestors there, because you also assume that we're all related via a common ancestor. So if you put those assumptions in, then the evidence that you want for your theory is then going to be, okay, we should see our ancestors in the fossil record in the ground. We should be able to dig these up, and there'll be fossilized bones. Now, and because evolution works by increments, we should see an incremental process of us, or these different creatures, looking more like us as you go forward in time up the fossil record, and looking more like the original ancestor as you go down in the record. And so there should be this gradual change. So that's what you're looking for. Now, the best argument for evolution is homology. Now, all that word means is similarity. That's the best argument for evolution. And I don't think, I don't think there's anything else. There's nothing else. It's homology. So things look the same. So what you're saying is, okay, because things look similar, therefore we have a common ancestor. That's essentially the broad scope of this idea of homology. Now, we get taught that at school. Things look the same, therefore there's a common ancestor. So humans look similar to chimps look similar to apes, or the other types of apes, sorry, and they look similar to, I mean, we even look slightly similar to horses and cats and donkeys, because we have a bone structure where we have 4 limbs, and even some of the things are named the same, like the tibia and fibula, and we have similar bones in similar places. And so you look at that and you say, oh, this seems like we're quite similar. Therefore, we must have had, as you go up in time, we must have had a common ancestor. Of course, what we're not taught at school is that if you take the assumption that we have a common designer, then you would also expect to find the same evidence that we look similar to other animals because we're made by a common designer. And an example I use or I like is that if you're the city mayor and you're commissioning a new bridge in your city to build across the river, you don't say to the construction company, please, you might say, oh, like I want it to look different. I want it to be a unique bridge on the outside. But you wouldn't say, I want the structure of the bridge to be totally unique, one that you've never done before. You wouldn't be a very sensible mayor if you said that. You'd say, look, I want you to, of the thousands of bridges you built before, I want you to use the same structure type because they've always stood well. And so anyway, so, bridges look very similar. Cars from the same company look very similar. You can do this with non-physical things as well as physical things. When things look similar, I know the successive generations of iPhones look similar. And that's because the engineers that designed them are the same engineers and they pass down their knowledge to the same people. And anyway, you get this idea of a common designer, right? So God is the common designer. So he's used the same type of materials to make different animals and humans. So what they're saying is that, okay, when we look today, there's some animals that look similar to us. And therefore, when we look in the fossil record, if we find what we should find is this convergence that we believe that, so they believe is that chimps and humans are related. And so as you go back, there should be some type of convergence. And so the evidence for that, they would say, is looking at these fossils of different animals. And of course, right away, I've said that even if you find these fossils that look more similar or like, in between a chimp and a human, you're still, that doesn't do away with your presuppositions, because if we take our presupposition, well, there could have been an animal that lived in the past that was like kind of in between. It doesn't mean that we were related. Now, of course, they'll go on and say, well, we see this change happening today. We see natural selection, and we do see natural selection, but we don't see natural selection work on such a wide variety, especially when you look at the genome, when you look at the genetic evidence. So humans are 99.9% similar to each other. So there's a 0.1% difference. And you've probably heard this figure, 99%, or we're 98% similar to apes. But that's totally not true. There's the way they've calculated that is they've deleted massive sections of the genome just to make it match up more, because it's hard to count differences. A more realistic number would be something like 85%. Our genome is 85% similar to a chimp's genome. So anyway, you've got this huge gap between 85% and 99.9%. So really, the natural selection can't bridge that gap mathematically if you calculate the rate that mutations are going at the moment. And so again, I have to assume uniformitarianism, but if you calculate that rate, you're never going to bridge that gap. There's not enough time to bridge that gap. So the best evidence, so the evidence that you're looking for, if you're under the evolutionary scenario or framework, is you're looking for apes that look, ancient apes, past apes, that look similar to current day apes and similar to humans. But all the evidence shows is that you either have something that is definitely like an ape, very ape-like, or very human-like. And this, so say this is the average human today, and this is the average chimp today. Okay, there's this variation in that. And they're trying to, but then as we look in the fossil record, it still goes like that. It doesn't go in between. And what I'm saying, what you mentioned was the example of Homo habilis. They're saying, okay, we've found one that comes much more closer to this. But every time they find one of them, it's usually found out years later that, oh, this was a mix of human and ape bones. So when you look at proposed chimp men or proposed ape men, sorry, they will either be a man dressed up to look like an ape, or an ape, like a prehistoric ape or prehistoric man dressed dressed to look like an ape, or prehistoric ape dressed to look like a man. And when I say prehistoric, it's not prehistoric in biblical framework. And then you can get a third category, and the third category is a mixture of ape and human bones. So I'd encourage people to look at that video, because we talk about Neanderthal man, Australopithecus afarensis, talk about Homo erectus, so all these common ones, and we split them up. We say these are men, these are apes because of X, Y, Z. This is the evidence that shows like they look like apes, they look like men. This one in between, that's a mixture of ape and human bones.
I remember you spoke to me about the percentage of genome being the same between animals and human beings. Like I guess you could ask, why is it not more different? Why is it 99.9 and 85%? Why isn't it 99.9 and 20%, for example? And you were saying that it's to do with like we couldn't like digest and eat animals if they weren't like similar enough to our DNA. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And so what you need to think about is, okay, well, what does the DNA do? Well, DNA codes for it does a number of things, but one of the purposes we know of it is it codes for proteins. And well, we eat proteins, we eat different things, and one of the things we eat is proteins, and we break them down, and then we create proteins. So the DNA codes for the proteins, but our body creates the proteins, and it needs the amino acids. So proteins are made up of amino acids, right? So you've got one protein, and that's made up of amino acids. We eat proteins and other types of food, and we break them down into amino acids, and those amino acids get joined back together in our body, and that's how we survive and how we live. Like, that's how building blocks, our cells are built by proteins. So if our DNA, so if the things we eat do not resemble, like if we don't eat those same amino acids that we're made of, then we don't exist. So that's how that works. And so I often say to people that if we were, because basically the false argument is set up that, okay, like if we're created and not evolved, then why do we have similar DNA? And one of the other things I point out, well, we're actually 50% similar to a banana as well. And I think I've heard the figure of 80% similar to a mouse. And you think, wow, okay, well, and you think, well, humans, we should be so different, as you said. Maybe it should be 1% or 2% or 20%. Like, it shouldn't be 60, 50% similar to a banana. But the fact is, because of what I just said about the breaking down of proteins and using the amino acids that we eat, if we had vastly different DNA to the things around us or the things that we eat, the only thing we could probably eat would be each other. So basically that argument's pushing you into a corner and saying, okay, you've got to have vastly different DNA. Okay, if God created the world like that, then he would have created us to eat each other. But of course, that's not true.
Yeah. Cool. Maybe we should start wrapping up. I know it's late for you in Australia.
Sure. Yeah. We can meet again if you want.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Is there any final thoughts you want to share?
I think it'd be good to talk. Maybe we could do this another time. Talk about the. So why I was saying, okay, this is important for the gospel, right? This issue, because of this logical inconsistency of death before sin, and it'd be great to share with you, like, because that was the thing I did not realize 4 years ago, prior to joining CMI and working in the creation evolution debate. Even before I joined, I didn't realize that this was an issue, and this is a reason why Christians should think about this. I guess even if you're a non-Christian and you're considering the Christian story and the narrative, does it stack up, then it's another important issue as well. And so that's the death before sin. And so we could talk about that. I could show you, I can bring up an image that just explains it quite clearly.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah. There's something else I find quite fascinating in Genesis, is that God God created us in His image, and like that there is a clear distinction between when He created animals and when He created human beings.
Yes.
And the implications that have as well. Like if we just believe in human evolution from apes, then what really makes us different from animals? And why should there be a different law from killing an animal to killing a human being? And like where does the worth of human beings come from? The intrinsic worth of an individual human being. If it doesn't come from being made in the image of God, and to me it doesn't really make sense that human beings have intrinsic value. It's only in that context.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I remember you talking to me about that before. I think it's a great point. And that's why it's kind of logical when people start to say, well, you know what, like we shouldn't eat animals, or we should be removing humans to let the other living parts of the earth flourish. But yeah, I mean, I think those arguments unwind themselves when you see that actually Earth becomes a non-productive place without the tending of the earth, which is just what Genesis says. There needs to be this tending. There needs to be the humans to be in charge. Otherwise, it just goes into a desert, or it goes wild. And obviously there's wild spaces that are productive, but this increase in productivity that comes about because of human ingenuity is quite interesting. But yeah, you're right. So like, why would, if we are just another animal, where do we get that intrinsic worth from? I don't understand how. Yeah, I don't understand how we get that. And I'm trying to think. Before I was a Christian, and I believed that we had this. I was made in the image of God. I guess I still believe there was a God somewhere. There was a creator of some sort, because it's just too obvious the difference that there was in humans. But yeah, but people that fully believe, that we're not created by God, where do you get your intrinsic worth from? You have to make it up. It has to come from within, I guess.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
who's to say an animal can't do that?
Yeah, exactly. I think something else it would be great to talk about in the future is what is the role of human beings versus God in Genesis, and when it comes to issues like global warming.
Yeah. Global warming, that's a good issue as well. The global warming, Jesus is coming back. Get ready.
Yeah. And what is human beings' role in global warming and
So yeah.
and
Preach the gospel,
God's
global warming. Sorry, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
And what is God's role? What it says about that in Genesis, I think that's quite interesting. Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Scott. Would love to speak with you again. Really appreciate you and your friendship and all the time that you have put into research and into the story of creation and your studies with geophysics and and it's been a really good conversation.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I've enjoyed thinking. I hadn't thought a lot about the millennium and how that would work with people getting older. I just hadn't thought about that a lot before. So that's interesting. Some things to recommend.
Yeah, it's really like kind of sparked something in me that's like I've been inspired by listening to other people talking about how much more productive the world has become the more people we have been born.
Yes.
Because each human being has brought a net good to the world.
Yes.
And but and that kind of thinking makes you like have a positive view of the future, and
Yes.
gives you motivation to do to use your time well and do good.
Yeah.
So it's like it's quite interesting with that conversation how with Town. It is a global warning.
Yeah.
Jesus is coming back, and you really don't want to be following the Antichrist and worship him and get the mark of the beast. You would much rather learn about Jesus, follow him, and have eternal life, rather than eternal suffering and punishment, by placing your trust in the evil one rather than the good one, the God who is good. Yeah.
That was interesting. This is another whole discussion, but there's this guy called Malthus. So it's Malthusianism. Have you heard of that? So it's like a guy that was about 200 years ago, and he was the one that came up with this idea of overpopulation, and that kind of equivalates us. He got the idea from bacteria growing, and that bacteria overpopulates, so it runs out of all the food, and then it dies off. And so that's a really awful thing. And said, well, the same's going to happen with humans. But that's the thing he missed out. What was you saying is each human brings about new ingenuity and progress. And so that doesn't happen when a bacteria splits apart, makes new bacteria. They're just the same bacteria, and they're just going to eat the food that's there. Whereas as humans, we're actually a net producer. And it's amazing that, we've got the whole of China that had the one-child policy, and now they're letting 2 or 3 children, because they're realizing that there's going to be this population decline. And that's a very fascinating subject as well.
Yeah.
That was the wrong thinking.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Scott. Have a good
Bless you,
night. Bless you.
Good to see you. Yeah.
You too.
See ya.